A blessed day to you. Thanks for joining me. My name is Nigel Daring. I am the originator of the philosophy of Darinism, and it's based on my analysis of existence and correlating that analysis with Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. So it's a revelation, it's an opening up of Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. I did 4 presentations before this one. I hope you check them out before you get to this. And please, if you're checking them out, check them out in order. They're labeled Darinism 1, Darinism 2, Darinism 3, and Darinism 4. Now, this presentation is going to be about life, not life in some general philosophical, moral sense, but life in physical terms. So that's where we're going to go. Now, if you want to find more about the philosophy of Darinism, or how in more detail, how I'm breaking down existence, and I'm relating it to Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. What you can do is you can pick up my book that you're seeing in the background there, Existence, God, Man, Society, and Nature, from www.amazon.com. And you can either type in the name of the book, or you can type in my name. If you type in my name, you'll see 16 books, including that particular book. So today, again, we're going to get into a discussion of life in physical terms. Now let's do a review. Well, from our last video, we looked at movements, and we looked at the properties of movements, right? And we said there are two kinds of movements. A movement fields. There's an extrinsic movement, and there's an intrinsic movement. So there's an intrinsic movement field, and there's an extrinsic movement field. And these movement fields have properties, and they can interact in particular ways. They interact with each other, and they interact with mass. Now, in interaction, you can have these events that take place. You can have summation, you can have internalization, you can have transfer, you can have reflection. By summation, I mean movements can overlap in space, and their overlap means that they're summed. Okay, at the point the fields are summed. Then there is what we call internalization. Internalization means when movements hit a body of mass, that the movement may be internalized in part or in whole. Then there's what we said is transfer. When a movement impacts a mass, it may be transferred in part or in whole. And we said before, for it to be transferred, it has to contact another mass. So that's how the process of transfer takes place. Then there is what's called reflection. Once a movement hits a mass, it may be reflected in part or in whole. Now, these processes, summation, internalization, transfer, reflection, can all take place when a movement impacts a mass, a body of mass. Okay? Um, Now, or even individual masses, even an individual energy unit, these processes can take place except for internalization. An energy unit doesn't internalize movement, but it certainly sums it and transfers it. Conceivable that it can even reflect it, but I think we'll stick to more conceiving of summation and transfer when it comes to heat units or mass units, when they're impacted by a movement. All right. Now, um, that's not to discount that there could be reflection also. Now, we compared intrinsic and extrinsic movements, and we found a couple of you know noteworthy points. Intrinsic movements are infinite in properties. They're infinite in dimension, just in terms of their reach, and they're also infinite in terms of their reproducibility. Right? At any point in space, what you put you have a mass and in an intrinsic field, the mass gets affected by a line of action from that field, and that effect that's taking place, that action that's taking place, does not deplete the field at any point, because at any point that mass gets affected, right? And let's say it shifts or it moves from that point. If you put another mass at that particular point, then that mass is going to be affected in the very same way as the original mass by that intrinsic field. So intrinsic fields are has this infinite property to them. Extrinsic movements are are definite. That means they're finite in their dimensions. Light has a definite reach, right? In terms of its expanse and in terms of its dimension. All right. Now, intrinsic movements are potential. They're potential fields. That means they don't actually exist as physical presences. They're potential fields, but they do manifest when with the presence of mass, and so they impact mass. Now, extrinsic movement fields are actual physical presences. Light is. It's a presence that has a definite reach in terms of its dimension. Okay? Those are two distinct properties of intrinsic and extrinsic movements. In summation, intrinsic movements, their fields don't get summed by lapping onto itself, let's say, right? So an intrinsic movement field from a given center of mass won't ever lap onto itself to make a stronger field. What happens is, if they have different centers of mass with their intrinsic movement fields, those intrinsic movement fields can overlap and sum, right? The fields can sum, so it's the fields from different centers of mass that can overlap and sum. An extrinsic movement field, when we're thinking of it summing, we want to think of the field itself, that given definite field, as overlapping itself in an area of space, and by overlapping itself, it becomes stronger. So greater in magnitude. Now, movements, we also said, they have magnitude and speed character. movements have magnitude and speed character. But before I go into that, let's also remember, in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic movements, we did say that an intrinsic line of actions, when they do get transferred, they become extrinsic lines of actions. Okay? Now, remember that when the intrinsic line of actions get transferred to the extrinsic line of action, the intrinsic field itself is not depleted because it infinitely replenishes itself. But what happens is when through that process of continual transfer from intrinsic to the extrinsic field itself gets broader and broader, right? So it's expanding. So the light field itself is expanding, and that we said explains the dark energy that in the universe, that continual transfer from intrinsic to extrinsic field. Now, back to magnitude and character. We had said that movements have magnitude, character to them. They have different strengths, right? And for instance, we said that gravity is extremely weak compared to the electrical field, right? That field of gravity is extremely weak. Now, speed character we're dealing with in terms of the impact of a movement field on mass, and it does produce speed or resistance to speed, but there's a speed character that the effect of that push produces from the movement field. We also said that there's a universality of movement and mass interaction. That means at any level, once we understand the principles of intrinsic and extrinsic movement interaction and with masses, and the transfer of intrinsic to extrinsic field, once we understand those processes, those processes are universal, whether they happen at the atomic or subatomic level, or within, or at the level of stars and galaxies in the cosmic universe. We also made the point, and we distinguish between motion and movement. Motion is always relative, right? Motion depends on our position with respect to some other mass. Movement, however, is absolute. Movement is just that physical or potential presence, and its effect upon any given mass is just an absolute fact of reality. It doesn't depend on any position that we may take to say consider it or not. Movement is just an absolute value, absolute in its dimension, in its effect upon mass. Now, let's move on. Now, we said that there's in the physical realm, we have mass with its intrinsic movement, right? And then we have the energy units with its intrinsic movement, which builds greater masses with the intrinsic movement, and then we have the extrinsic movements, right? And the intrinsic movements, this is another comparison that I neglected to mention, but the intrinsic movements, if they're the only movements in consideration in physical existence, they would get all the masses in existence and have some preferred arrangement, some static arrangement of all the masses. But that doesn't happen because you have extrinsic movements, and the extrinsic movements affect the masses, and they have a dispersive effect, not they don't tend towards static arrangement. They have a net effect that's dispersive in the transfer of the of lines of action. What you're going to get is dispersion of masses. Now, what do is existence then a matter of masses with their movements, their intrinsic movements and extrinsic movements, just operating in this weird random soup, and not, and things just spread out or just come together and just, haphazardly function. That's not the case, right? We have things that agglutinate and come together and function together. We have things that are temporarily gathered together and sometimes fall apart, but it's not. It doesn't. The universe itself isn't this random operating thing of masses and movements, operating, and motion taking place and just randomly going on like that, right? So what I'm leading into is this discussion of order, and order is relevant. Order as a concept, it is relevant. All right. Now let's provide a definition of order. Order, when we say order, we're talking the togetherness of distinct entities such that they bear relationships to each other in a whole. That's what we're talking about when we say order. We're talking about the togetherness of distinct entities such that they bear relationships to each other in some whole. Now, you might have what I call non-functional order. The whole doesn't function by active coordination of its distinct components. So that's a non-functional order. Then there's what I call a functional order. The whole actively functions to protect its state of being. Now, a functional order constitutes a crude definition of life for us, right? Life is order, actively protecting its state of being, right? It's functioning to protect its state of being. I'm here talking to you because I am functioning. My body is functioning as an order, coordinating itself as an order. Okay, organisms represent order. So life represents a functional order represents some crude definition of life, right? The act of order trying to protect itself reveals a survival instinct. So then order, it's not just order functioning to protect itself. It has a survival instinct. It is trying to survive. It's trying to protect its identity as an order. All right? Now, an order, functional order, operates programmatically. It is programmed to operate. Okay? It is programmatically trying to maintain itself in its state, in a state of being. Okay, so it's not random, it's not wild. It just doesn't happen to be that there's this order functioning, just operating together. It's functioning in some programmatic fashion to maintain its state of existence. Now, with that, with order, now that we understand order as being essential to life and defining life, I want to talk about what I call levels of life, right? Now, the nothingness. Let's talk about the nothingness. The nothingness where there is no mass. There is no mass, there is no movement, either extrinsic or intrinsic. That means nothing exists. The state of nothingness, right, is a level of life in itself. There's, right? And if any reference that we make to to life in the nothingness, then we'll say that's spiritual. Now, the energy field itself represents a life. Why is that? The energy field with its heat units or mass units, for it to remain together as a body, then it has to be functioning together. In some active way, it is being kept together as a body, and because it's functioning together, right? The units are there, right? These mass units are there, but they're not. They don't all just scatter apart and fall apart and just drift off into infinity, and just drift off just keep on drifting off without end. They are the energy units of the energy field do constitute a body, a whole body, right? No, so that's it's alive. The energy field is alive. Matter is alive. Matter is existing as a functional order. It's there, it's not falling apart, it's existing as an order over time. It's maintaining itself over time. It's actively maintaining itself over time. It's programmatically maintaining itself over time. So matter is alive. So that, right? Now, organisms, biological organism, life, that's another kind of life. I'm an organism, plants, fungi, bacteria, all these things represent another kind of life. They represent an order, and they're actively protecting their order, their state of being. They have a survival instinct. All right? Now, within levels of life, we have forms of life. Right? So, humans, we're one form of life. Cats, dogs, chimps, we can go on and on. Trees, different kinds of trees. So you have forms of life, right? So matter, you have different kinds of matter that are out there. We do have atoms. We have different kinds of atoms. So even in the nothingness, there is life, and so we might think of different beings in the nothingness, but we'll get into that discussion later on as we're talking about Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, and thinking about life in another sense. So we have these levels of life, right? We're talking the nothingness constitutes one level of life. The energy field is another level of life. The material realm, matter, is another level of life, and we have organisms, right, as another level of life. Now, what we have to realize is that each level of life is built from a prior level of life, except the very first. So the nothingness isn't built from anything prior. The nothingness where there is nothing physical, no mass, no heat, right? No energy, no movement. That's the original state of life. So the nothingness is the original state of life. It generated the mass field, the heat field, right? The field of heat, the field of energy generated the energy field. The energy field itself is what builds matter. Matter is constituted of heat. right? We said that before. Matter is made out of heat. Now, organisms themselves are made out of matter. So we then become a functional state of matter. We're functioning matter. All right? Matter is really then functioning energy, functioning heat. Right? Heat units gathered together, it's in a functional state. And the heat field becomes a function of the nothingness that existed prior to it. That's the source of its being. Now, death. Now, we looked at life as emerging from the functionality of life dependent upon a level of life, right? So we said the organisms, we're a functional order constituted of matter. Matter is a functional order constituted of the energy field. Death means reversion of life to its prior level. What that means is that organisms, right, when we die, I become just plain matter. I'm no longer a functional order. Organisms are no longer dead organisms represent just matter. They right? So death is a loss of life constitutes functionality. Death means a loss of functionality. Right? So when matter itself loses its life, when matter dies, because matter does die, it just becomes heat. It becomes energy, right? So death means reversion. Then we can conceive of the whole energy field dying and just becoming the nothingness. It just becomes, that's it, right? So death means reversion of life to the level of life from which it's made. And no, before the very first presentation I did, and in looking at the formula F equals ma, I concluded that we're going to have to logically deduce certain things about existence that we may not be able to prove by our senses, but we can logically deduce it. Now, with that, I always said that. Well, after that, I said when I brought up intrinsic movements, I said that there's extrinsic movements, and I said light is an extrinsic movement, right? Light is what we're most familiar with. Now, light itself is an extrinsic movement relevant to the material realm, and it's relevant to defining the material realm. I'm going to get back to that in a second, but let's think of the energy field, for instance. We have these mass units, these energy units, these heat units that constitute the field. They have their intrinsic movements, right? Which is your gravity, your electricity, and your magnetism. If they do move, you get this magnetic field. All right. So if we have this field with these of mass, with these charges, what's going to happen is that it would be a static field. Everything would just be arranged into some static whole, and that's where the field would be, just static. Existence, however, requires dynamism. Physical existence requires dynamism, as well as spiritual, we might say. We'll talk about that later on. It's dynamic. It's dynamic. So there has to be some movement, some extrinsic movement in that field whereby it's not static, but there's an extrinsic movement that impacts these units, so that they're not in place, just static as energy units. All right. So I call that movement that's in that realm, in the realm of just plain energy, without matter, without organisms. I call that movement native movement. Then we have the material realm, right? And that realm is defined by light, right? Light defines the material realm. So that's the movement that defines the material realm. Then there is this organisms. We ourselves as organisms, and all biological organisms, there's this movement. There has to be this movement that is present in the earth, which I call the breath of life, because it's not just it's not just matter that's there, and it's not just light that's there and energy that's there, but we do have, it's not just these intrinsic movements also, but we do have this movement that I'm going to argue is on the earth, and it's the breath of life, and it's responsible for some distinction between organisms and plain matter. All right. Now let's go back a little and talk some more about this thing about movements. The energy field itself, right, is defined by mass. It's alive. It's defined by mass, which is just heat, just units of heat. And it's defined by this native movement. Now, matter represents an accumulation of energy, an accumulation of heat. And you can get different material particles, or atomic particles, just by accumulating your heat units differently, and you can and get different interactions. Now, matter represents a functional order. Now, what is it that distinguishes a mass as matter from just another mass that's in the energy field? Let's say there's another mass in the energy field that's functional, and it represents a functional order. How is it distinguished from mass, another functional mass that is matter? Light. Matter, by definition, processes light. Light is integral to the life of matter. Matter functionally, operationally takes in light. That movement is necessary to its life. It processes it. That means it has light bouncing, transferred within its being, and light helps to define it, and it also extrudes light. It also excretes light, right? So it consumes it, it excretes it. So matter, by definition, light by definition defines matter, right? It is what is essential to matter. Matter processes light, as opposed to just a plain mass, accumulated mass in the energy field. Matter distinguishes itself in functionality by processing light. So you might actually have mass in the energy field that may be functional, or might even be non-functional, right? Right? But but in what makes a mass in the energy field that's functional, what makes it matter is that it processes light. Now, organisms, we ourselves are made out of matter, right? But what also what is it that distinguishes me, or as an alive person, physically, as a biological organism, from someone who just died, right? I'm functioning. I'm a functioning order, right? So that's one thing. The person who died doesn't have life, and is not a functional order. What and what distinguishes what also distinguishes myself from this person who died is the fact that I have this breath of life, this movement that is up on the earth. Okay? It's important to our lives. We do process this movement. We don't perceive it the way we do perceive light, because God, who designed existence, wants us to perceive light for our lives and the conduct of our lives. It's not necessary really to perceive this breath of life, but it is there, and it helps distinguish us as alive from something that's dead. It distinguishes us from any accumulated mass that's matter in the material realm, any accumulated mass. This being able to have this breath of life distinguishes us from this any other accumulated matter. Okay? Now, so the energy field has this native movement that's unique to it. The material realm has this as light that defines it uniquely. Matter processes light. Organisms have this breath of life. Now, what we must realize also is when since each their levels of life, we said the energy field constitutes a level of life, the material realm constitutes a level of life, and organisms constitute another level of life. By virtue of the fact that each level of life depends on another one prior, so organisms as a body, we're made out of the material realm, right? And the material realm is made out of the energy field. By virtue of that relationship, we organisms aren't just made out of matter, they're made out of light, right? The light is integral to our beings as material beings, right? All organisms, the matter and light is integral to their being, right? A material realm, energy is integral to its being, as well as a native movement, because native movement defines the energy field also. Now, death. When death means loss of functionality. Remember, when organisms die, right, they lose their functionality as organisms, as the order attributable to that functionality. They lose that functionality, and they become matter, right? So they become what it is they're made out of. So what happens? So they just become plain matter. I die, I just become plain matter. I'm not functioning as organism anymore. I'm just matter. What happens is that in death, loss of functionality, your components gets released. Then the breath of life is lost from me in death. The breath of life is lost from organisms in death. And so breath of life is released, and the organisms just become matter. The matter also dies, right? And remember before, when we say matter dies, when it loses functionality, all that's there is an area of heat, because it's because matter is accumulated heat. But what else does get released in death? Light. Matter is made out of light and heat. And it's very right. So when it dies, they get released. Heat and light just gets released, and the heat just gets released, and it's just dispersed and uncoordinated, and that's just because the whole material being lost its functionality. It can't functionally process light anymore. It can't functionally keep its components together anymore. All right. Um, the material field also, not yet, but at some point it is going to die and lose its native movement and lose its, it'll just not just disappear into the nothingness from which it's made. All right. Okay, so let's get into a more sophisticated discussion of life. Uh, Before we gave a simplistic definition where we said life represents functional order. Now let's expand our definition, and we can now say life in the physical realm represents a functional order that programmatically balances its movement and mass constituents. Life represents a programmatic order that that balances its movement and mass constituents. So, what's essential to life? Program. Program is essential to life, right? Right, and its movement. It has movement and mass constituents that are essential to it, and the program of life is balancing these movements and mass constituents so that the order is functionally maintained. All right. Now, well, let's talk about the life of nothingness. Levels of life, we said, arise from prior levels. We said organisms come come from matter, right? They represent some functional order of matter, and according to our definition of life, well, there is balancing, and according to program, in some programmatic way of the material components of an organism along with its um, movement requirements. Matter itself came out of the matter represents some functional order that processes light as its movement. It represents a functional order of some agglutinated or accumulated mass from the energy field, and so matter came out of the energy field, but the energy field itself came out of the nothingness, right? Now, what that means is that the nothingness is alive. That means prior to the physical realm, prior to any mass being present in the physical realm or any movement, the nothingness must be alive, because for the nothingness to be generating um, life, to be generating existence, the physical realm, it itself must be alive. Now, there must also, in that nothingness, there must also be intelligence, because what's happening is that life in the physical realm isn't just random and chaotic and stuff, it is defined. It is defined along order, it's defined along program, right? And for you to have a program, we need a programmer. We need an intelligence responsible for programming these orders to function in a certain state, right? We don't imagine the components of a computer just falling together and just operating in some systematic functional way. We attribute an intelligence to the design of the computer. So the design of life in the material realm itself has an intelligence responsible, an intelligence in the nothingness, right? And along with that intelligence in the nothingness, there must be some body of it to the being of the nothingness from which it is creating the essential substance of of life, mass, from which it's creating mass, from which it's generating movement. Now, we're going to define God then as the intelligence in this nothingness with his spiritual body, and God is the intelligence in the nothingness who uses his spiritual body to generate life and order in the universe. So that is God. He exists in the nothingness, and he's the intelligence in the nothingness, and he creates from the body of his being. Now, life depends on its source level. Each form of life depends on the level of life from which it's made to continue to sustain itself. Each form of life depends on the level of life from which it's made to sustain itself, which means organisms depend upon matter to survive. Organisms are made out of matter, so it's going to need matter from the material realm to sustain itself. Matter is made out of heat and light. Well, let's take that one back again. Organisms made out of matter, also the breath of life. So we need matter. We also need breath of life in us to sustain ourselves. So we're constantly taking in these components. Matter is made out of heat. So matter itself has to continually sustain itself by internalizing heat. It's also made out of light, so it continually has to sustain itself by internalizing heat and light. Right. So it depends upon the heat field. It depends upon the light field. The energy field itself depends upon the nothingness. The nothingness is sustaining the energy field. That's another point I want to make. The nothingness didn't just produce the energy field and produce the material realm. It's actively sustaining it. Okay? So the energy field as a body, as a functional body, it depends upon the nothingness for its source of life. Now, I want to point this out, that in terms of physical realm, communication is important to maintenance of life in the physical realm. It must occur internally in the life in any life form, right? Parts within it must be communicating for the order to be maintained. Communication must occur externally between life forms. Okay, so that life forms get a sense of their place and know how to and can respond to the world out there, so that to sustain their lives. Communication is important to that survival instinct. Perception. Forms of life must be able to perceive their internal and external environment. They must be able to know what's in their environment, internally and externally, in order to maintain that order. So perception is important to the survival instinct. Now, let's get to the very structure of life forms, right? What we find is that it's defined by a center-periphery relationship. Life as a center-periphery relationship in its very makeup. Or it may have even multiple, and a life form may have even multiple centers and peripheries. And the whole life form is defined programmatically. Alright? Now, the periphery is the body, represents the entire body of being. The center is also part of the body of being, but it's distinct, it's encased, and protected by the periphery. The periphery receives stimuli from the internal and external environment and relays the information it gathers through the body of its being to the center. Right? Now the center integrates and processes the information and determines appropriate response which it relays to the body of the being, right? And the body of the being responds or reacts appropriately. Right? So the center integrates information from the body of the being, puts it all together, processes it, and determines the appropriate response. All right. Now, so what is the center responsible for in sum? It's responsible for perception, coordination, control. It is in the center that the life form gains its perception to determine, it gains its sense of reality in the environment. That's where it becomes real. It's in the center that there's this sense of perceiving reality, and that occurs from integrating stimuli from that's sent from the body, from the periphery. The center is also responsible for coordination and control of the entire of the body, or even locally of the being, of the life form. So that the entire thing functions in a coordinated fashion. The center is responsible. To the extent that the thing functions in a coordinated fashion, the center is responsible as directing the activities that are germane to that whole thing, to that whole deal. Now, the periphery is responsible for bodily definition, right? It defines the limitation. It provides support and protection of the center. It relays environmental stimuli to the center, as well as responds to directions from the center in terms of maintain, so that it maintains it's the order. And the periphery is also responsible for gathering nutrient support from the environment. The program of a life form basically operates through the center-periphery relationship. That's how the programs operate, through the center-periphery relationship. So the life is dependent on program, and the program manifests itself through center-periphery relationship. Sort of like the computer with its central processing unit, and then you have the accessories around it. The central processing unit sends out the information that gets it. I'm not even a computer expert. I don't even know why I went there, but anyway, that gets the whole thing functioning, right? In some fashion. The center of the energy field, right? The center of the energy field itself is the body of God, which is the body of God, which is the center of existence. That means the energy field doesn't have a defined physical presence as a center. What it is the body of God that originated it, that's actually coordinating it and maintaining it as a whole. So the nothingness, which is the body of God, which that entails the body of God, is actually alive and actively maintaining the physical realm. All right. Now, let's talk about stability and survival ranges. All right. Each life form keeps ranges for movement and mass components. Each life form keeps ranges, right? There's homeostasis. We know about homeostasis and maintaining homeostasis in our bodies. All organisms have to maintain um, um, material components, biochemical components in its body, and right, and also movement components, because it's movement, right? It's movement that actually is responsible for motion. All right. Now, the same thing happens for mass. Mass for matter, I mean. The same thing happens for matter. Matter is constantly taking in heat because it's made out of heat and even other mass components, and it's constantly taking heat, it's constantly taking in light to buttress its existence as matter, to buttress its state of order, its functional state of order. It's constantly taking that stuff in, right? It act now, so it takes them in and constantly maintains itself. Now it actively, each life form actually actively transfers the necessities of its being, its necessities of life within its being to maintain the subcomponents of its being and to have internal motion, internal activity. So it has to take in um, mass components and it right, and it has or mass units, and it has to take in um, movement. It has to internalize movement. So we're constantly, we as organisms and all organisms are constantly taking in um, um, matter as well as biological life, which is present in the entire Earth. We're constantly taking it in. Um, we're constantly processing it. We're constantly within our being to make sure that our order is maintained. Our order is life. All organisms do it. The same thing with matter as life. It's constantly taking in light. It's constantly taking in heat, and and even other material components or masses of heat. Um, so as to maintain its being, and it's transferring. It does transfer these the components that it internalizes from its environment. It does transfer it within its being, within the body of its being, and this is important to maintain order. Now, in terms of maintaining order, it's not just that the being just internalizes stuff from the environment. It doesn't just internalize the mass requirements, and it doesn't just internalize um, um, movement requirements. It also actively extrudes weight, mass, and movement waste. So we do it as organisms, and all organisms do it. They extrude movement, they extrude waste, right? Um, we extrude material waste, we extrude even energy waste, heat waste, right? We extrude movement waste, right? We, we we extrude biological life or the breath of life, and we also extrude yeah, we extrude heat. We get rid of it also, right? Because our state of being as organisms, and all organisms as a state of being, it's based upon matter, right? And matter itself is based upon heat. So we do take, and we're dependent upon all the levels of existence before us, as are all organisms. So we take in matter, we take in heat, and we process and we extrude matter, we extrude heat. We take in we take in biological life, we take in light, right? We have extrinsic movements within us, right? Now, now, we also take in the native movements that are associated with the energy field, right? We take them in, we process them. The body, we have sophisticated programs that are balancing all these components of matter, of heat, of light, and of um of light and biological life and native movement, or the programs are balancing it all to assure a functional order of being, of an organismic existence. Um, so that goes on. There's internalization of these components to assure life, and then there's excretion also. All right, and that occurs for organisms. It occurs for matter. Matter takes in energy and movement. It also extrudes energy and movement. It also excretes energy and movement. So matter does get rid of heat, and it does get rid of life. It is actively taking in heat, it's actively taking in light, and it's actively getting rid of heat, it's actively getting rid of life. It is maintaining ranges within its being. And so the process of taking in and pushing out is all about maintaining survival ranges of subcomponents, and maintaining survival ranges of movement within the being. So matter takes in heat, it takes in light, but it also has to have native movement also within it, and it's extruding that also as part of its active maintenance of life. Now let's discuss original and continuous birth. Physical life forms were born and they die. That's just a reality, right? Now, the energy field itself was born out of nothing, out of the body of God. That, right? And it is being sustained by God Himself, by the body of God. It's born out of the nothingness, it's being sustained out of the nothingness. It is feeding itself off the nothingness, right? Matter was originally born from the energy field, and it's continuously sustained through the order of each material being, right? So, for instance, we'll say a galaxy represents an order. There's stars there accumulated in, right? And they remain accumulated over an extended period of time. That represents an order. Now, stars die within in galaxies. They do die, right? And when they die, they lose their functionality. You have this area of heat that's left back that gradually dissipates because it's no longer functional order. And then, of course, in death you also lose light, because light is essential to the definition of matter. But stars are also born. Now, I'm going to suggest to you, I'm going to state categorically that the birth of stars in galaxies is not a random process. It's not happenstance. Those are coordinated activities within the body of galaxies. Okay, so matter is born. Um, um, now, organisms were originally made from matter, and organisms sustain themselves continuously. Once they're originally made from matter, right, and their origin is out of matter, and then they continually sustain themselves through their their programmatic function. They reproduce themselves through the programmatic function of their order. All right, so of their biological order, um, and so we continue to reproduce ourselves, right, through biological function, right, copulation, childbirth, and so forth. Um, but organisms originally came from matter, and they continuously generate themselves like that. Just getting back to galaxies also, whole galaxies are born out of out of matter originally, but galaxies also they also die. Um, they also reproduce. Um, atoms reproduce. Atoms represent functional order. Okay, so let's move on. Now, we said within a level of life, you have forms of life. Um, so we have different kinds of organisms, right? Um, so we know that, but atoms, stars, galaxies are forms of life, right? Now, if you notice, stars comes as star systems, right? Stars comes as star systems, and you have planets orbiting them. The planets represent the periphery, and the stars themselves represent the center. Um, atoms atoms have a center, which is the nucleus, and the electrons orbiting represents the periphery. The galaxies themselves, um, because they maintain order over time, they do have a center-periphery relationship going on. At the center of galaxies, you have a black hole. The black hole is functional, right, in the galaxy. So the stars in the galaxy represent almost like cells in the body. There are billions of them, right? So the stars in the galaxy are like cells in the body, and the black hole constitutes the center. Now these all black holes have to have the center. The center is functional. Okay, it's going to absorb light. It's going to absorb energy, right? And it's also going to extrude these things. It's going to emit light. It's going to emit energy, right? That's part of its functional center. It's part of its way of communicating with its masses. Now, as I said before, stars are like cells in the body, and just like how cells in the body communicate to maintain their life, so do stars in a galaxy. Stars in the galaxies do communicate. For order to be maintained over time, communication has to occur. Communication has to occur between the stars. Communication has to occur between stars and planets. Communication has to occur between stars and black holes. This is a part of maintaining order, a functional order over time. Atoms are alive, stars are alive, galaxies are alive. Indeed, the whole physical realm is alive. And later on, as we discuss Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 some more, we're gonna realize that in the whole creation, that the only thing that has any kind of death in it is it's us as human beings. And I'll explain that some more in the future. Now, so God sustains existence. God defined existence. God, the body of God is the source and sustenance of its life, right? As well as its operational center. So the body of God is the source of life, and for the for existence, the energy field came out of the body of God, the nothingness, because the nothingness is alive. And the body of God is maintaining this field. It's coordinating it. So and the field depends upon it for life. right? Depends upon the nothingness, upon the body of God for life. So the body of God then is what we call the tree of life. It's what's sustaining. It's sustaining life in all in the physical realm. It's coordinating. It's sustaining it. It's that branch. It's the life. It's the source of life, of all life. Now let's relate what we've learned to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Now, before we go on, we need to clarify something here. Time in Genesis isn't time as we conceive of it. We conceive of a day as being this 24-hour cycle, but that's not what's going on in Genesis. Now, we have to look at time the way God looks at time, because in order for us to understand reality, remember I said that in the previous slide, we have to view reality the way God sees it, and that way we can get the truth of it. Time, as conceived in Genesis, the beginning pages of Genesis, Genesis chapter 1, is demarcated by event. It's the event that says a day, we have a day, we've completed a day, or we've begun a day. All right. So let's take a look, for instance, at Genesis chapter 1, verse 11. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself, upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and morning were the third day. That means just God bringing forth trees. The creation of trees and the end of that creation marked a day. It's the event. That's the distinction of the creation of that event that marked a day. So now, these events that are taking place that are called days, that are marked by the events, those may actually be taking place over millions of years or billions of years, or maybe a couple of years. Who knows? It doesn't matter. But the fact is that God created them, because you're not going to have the earth that just bring forth trees, right? Whatever order that's going on, that's in place, in existence, once God sets it up, the order is going to programmatically and systematically function to protect itself. It's not going to create something new. God has to create new orders and program them. So when it says he created trees, he's creating new orders. He's generating these. He's generating biological life. He's generating organisms, trees, and he's defining them. Right? He's defining a program, and their survival instinct as trees. All right. Now, so understanding that time isn't what we think of it. It's time as God thinks of it, it's demarcated, right? A day is demarcated by an event that's new, a novel event that God created something, and that creation represents a new day in creation, a new day in existence in the physical realm. So the creation marks an event, all right, and that demarcates a day. Okay, so it's the event that demarcates days, not the 24-hour cycle that we conceive of in terms of time. Now, I want to read Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. What's happening? There, as we said before, there was a nothingness, right, in which God existed, and out of that nothingness, out of that nothingness, out of the body of his being, created the heaven and the earth. Now, what's going on? What the first thing that he's going to create out of that nothingness, the heaven, is the energy field, the heat field. He brought in heat. And within that heat, he's accumulating units of heat, intensely accumulating units of heat in that field to create what's going to become matter. But so he accumulates it, it's without form and void. It's not matter. It doesn't have the dimensions of matter. It's not functioning as matter. Right? So it's just accumulated energy. What is it that makes it matter? Genesis chapter 1 verse 3. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. What then happens for him to bring in the mass, the accumulated mass, which is the earth, as matter, or to bring in all matter, he has to introduce this movement. It's light. That's why he brought in the light. Let there be light. What God is saying is now, wake it up. Wake it up. Wake up this accumulated mass as matter. Now it's become matter. And that's what matter is by definition. Matter processes light. It takes it in, it processes it, and it excretes it. It extrudes it. It actively does that for the duration of its life. And that's what it does as a functional order. So God introduces this movement. He strikes this energy field that already has its native movement, but he strikes it with light. Now that may be the whole field or part of the field, but he defines the field. It puts light in the field, right? It strikes it with light, and that light is what is critical for matter to come into existence. Now, it's not only that there's this accumulated mass, right, that becomes matter. Remember, program is important. God programs the order to function for it to become life. So matter is functioning programmatically. It's programmatically internalizing light. It's programmatically extruding light. It's programmatically taking in heat. It's programmatically extruding heat. Programmatically taking the native movement, programmatically extruding the native movement. All right. Now, so that's what's going on here. So God is in the nothingness. From the nothingness, he created the energy field. Within the energy field, he accumulated units of heat to form matter, and then he strikes the energy field with light and programmatically allows the matter to process the light, allows the mass, the accumulated mass, to process the light, and that processing, that accumulated mass that processes light and ensures its state of being as an accumulated mass becomes matter. Now, when we're reading through Genesis chapters 1, we see that God is essentially ordering the universe. And remember, we said order is important to life, right? He doesn't just create he doesn't just create matter. He doesn't just create the energy realm. He doesn't just create the energy field. He also creates matter out of that field. And then out of the matter, upon the face of the earth, he starts creating these life forms. So he creates them, and he defines it. He's defining them. He defines them by program, functional orders. Matter is alive. He's defining matter by programs to keep it alive. So what we're reading, as we read through Genesis chapter 1, what we're seeing is that God is bringing forth life these different levels of life and these different kinds of life, and he's programming them. All right. And then what we see. So he brings forth. It starts out with the energy. The nothingness, of course, was there before. God was there before in the nothingness. From that, he created the energy field. Out of the energy field, he created matter, and then out of matter, he's successively bringing life forms upon the earth. All right, and now when we get into Genesis chapter 2, um, we get a clue as to how he created organisms in general in the creation of man. He created man from the dust, from the earth, right? And we said that we are actually accumulated matter. So he created man out of the earth, right? And then he blew the breath of life in the man, right? That's a generic statement for how he created all the organisms. He created them out of the matter, accumulated matter, shaped them, or form them together, shape them together as the organism that they're going to be, and he strikes them with the breath of life, right? And wake them up into life as organisms, right? Um, so he takes from the nothingness, he creates matter, he creates the energy field, accumulates mass in the energy field, strikes it with light, strikes the field with light, and strikes, and the accumulated mass starts processing the light and as matter, and it does it so programmatically. And then on the earth, he accumulates different life forms also, and he accumulates matter that he's going to use, or the dust of the earth that he's going to accumulate it, and he's going to use that to become organisms, and he strikes the earth basically with the breath of life, because that's what that he uses to wake up these accumulated matter on the earth as biological life, as organisms, as live organisms, right? So he's determining existence by accumulating and mass and or accumulating matter, and instituting programs, and then striking with these movements that cause that become that power up the life of these power up life forms, right? So the native, it creates the energy field with its native movement. Native movement, of course, powers up the energy field. Then out of the energy field, he accumulates units of mass, right? And programs it along with striking the energy field with light, and wakes up this accumulated mass in the energy field, and it becomes matter, right? Functionally processing light. And then out of the matter, right, he creates, he shapes the what's going to become organisms, and they don't become alive as organisms until he strikes the earth with his breath of life, and he allows these organisms, he wakes up these organisms to life by allowing them to process this breath of life, and also by programming them to function in an organized way, that their order or state of being is maintained, and also that they're able to reproduce. All right, so that explains Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Now, just before we close out, I just want to make a quick note here about the background microwave radiation. That it happens because the energy field has light in there, as a light movement. God struck the energy field with light. So even if like where we don't have matter present, you still are going to have light still present. The field of light is still there. Remember, matter is actually just um, internalizing from that whole field of light and extruding to the whole field of light. But light is going to be there out in that in the energy field because God struck it with light. It made light, put light in the energy field, and so you're going to have this light that's ever present in this field that's causing some kind of motion in the field, right? Causing motion in the field, causing these heat units. It's the light in the field is impacting the heat units, and it's causing constant motion. So the background microwave radiation isn't an indicator of the Big Bang or any Big Bang. The Big Bang never happened. God created existence as you see it in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. He ordained the whole thing. Out of the nothingness, he created the energy field, and in the energy field, he accumulated what was to be matter, and he struck the energy field with light, and matter, and that woke up the accumulated mass that that was to become matter as matter, and then from the matter upon the face of the earth, he accumulated what different what was to become organisms, and that and he struck the material, the earth itself with biological life, and or with a breath of life, and that which organisms process, and for their life, and so we don't so the background microwave radiation isn't evidence of any Big Bang. It's just light is just present. It's a field, and it causes movements, movements of these energy particles, these heat particles, because it impacts them anywhere it is in the presence in the heat field, in the energy field. All right. All right. That's all we'll do for today. Until next time. Bye bye.